So, here's something that happened. In the first week of January, the United States took a very visible step in Venezuela. Across official statements, public press briefings, and international reporting, U.S. forces seized multiple oil tankers linked to Venezuelan crude, moved to enforce sanctions more aggressively, and announced a broader plan to oversee Venezuela's oil exports and sales worldwide. The White House made clear that it intended to tighten control over how Venezuelan oil moves, who it moves to, and even how the revenues are used. That sequence of actions, tanker seizures, enforcement language, and a declared policy of greater control over crude exports was broadcast widely. It read like a straightforward assertion of authority. The United States was reasserting influence over one of the Western Hemisphere's largest sources of crude. Markets reacted. Oil sector observers shifted their attention. And for a moment it looked like a strong, decisive move in a long-running geopolitical contest. But what we'll explore next is not whether the announcement sounded forceful, but what it actually changed on the ground. However, that surface reading didn't hold for very long. Almost as soon as the announcement settled, a different set of signals began to appear. They weren't dramatic and they weren't highlighted in press briefings. They showed up quietly in shipping data, trade flows, and market behavior. The kind of places most people don't look unless they have a reason to. Oil shipments did not decline in any meaningful way. They moved differently. Cargoes that once traveled familiar routes began showing up under new flags through secondary ports and via intermediaries that rarely attract attention. Transactions didn't stop. They changed structure. Payments shifted away from the most visible channels into ones that are harder to track and slower to regulate. From Washington, the picture still looked like control. From the perspective of ports, insurers, and logistics firms, it looked more like adjustment. The system didn't seize up. It flexed. This is where the initial interpretation starts to mislead. The assumption was that tightening pressure would narrow options. What actually happened was that options multiplied, not overnight and not perfectly, but enough to matter. And that raises a quieter question. If a policy is designed to restrict movement, but movement continues in altered form, what does that tell us? Not about intentions or resolve, but about outcomes. The absence of an immediate collapse isn't neutral information. It's a signal. It suggests preparation. It suggests learning. And it suggests that the effects of pressure are unfolding somewhere other than where the announcements were aimed. That's the point where the story begins to move away from appearances and toward consequences. So the real question isn't whether the policy sounded strong or even whether it was carried out as announced. The question is what actually changed where it matters. Did oil stop moving in meaningful volumes, or did it simply take different paths? Did revenues collapse in a way that altered behavior, or did cash flow stabilize enough to keep the system functioning? Did loyalty inside the country fracture, or did institutions adapt to new constraints? And did external partners step back, or did they quietly adjust their role? These aren't questions of politics or morality, they're questions of mechanics. In complex systems, pressure doesn't operate in a straight line. It moves through incentives. When one route closes, another becomes more attractive. When one payment channel is restricted, alternatives gain value. When risk increases in one area, it's redistributed elsewhere. If you've ever run a business, managed a supply chain, or worked inside a large organization, this logic is familiar. You don't stop operating because conditions worsen. You reconfigure. You reduce exposure. You find workarounds that keep the core running. When you look at the situation through that lens, the picture becomes more complicated. Some expected changes didn't occur. Flows continued. Transactions adjusted. Relationships shifted but did not disappear. At the same time, other changes did occur that weren't fully anticipated. New routes became routine. New partners gained experience. New methods became normalized. That's the part that's easy to miss if you focus only on official statements. Because what matters over time isn't whether a system absorbs pressure once, but whether it learns from it. And once learning happens, the baseline changes. The system that emerges afterward is not the same one that existed before the pressure was applied. When we talk about sanctions and pressure, we have to think of them the way an engineer thinks about restrictions on a system. You narrow one channel of flow and the fluid doesn't simply disappear. It finds another channel. That's what's happening with Venezuelan oil. The United States has taken visible steps, legal enforcement, naval interdictions, tanker seizures aimed at disrupting crude exports tied to Caracas. But the flows on the water tell a different story. Ships are still moving. Tankers that had been stuck in port have sailed. That doesn't mean chaos, it means adaptation. For years now, Venezuela and its partners have operated what analysts call a shadow fleet, a network of vessels that shift flags, change identities, and transfer oil at sea in ways that obscure origin. That network developed not because it was the preferred way to trade, but because when traditional routes and systems were closed off by sanctions, participants had to invent alternatives. Imagine a factory that loses access to its main highway. It doesn't shut down. It reroutes through back roads, smaller bridges, transfer points. Each leg of that route may look marginal by itself, a local road here, a ferry crossing there, but taken together they reconnect the supply chain. What was once visible and straightforward becomes circuitous and harder to trace. Oil markets are like that. When regular buyers and payment systems are restricted, sellers and buyers look for other options. They negotiate directly with intermediaries willing to assume risk. They accept non-traditional forms of settlement. They utilize vessels that aren't tied to the usual insured and flagged fleets precisely because those compliant carriers cannot touch sanctioned cargo. From the outside, these adjustments can seem like minor detours. In fact, they are structural shifts building redundancy into the system. When enforcement depends on broad compliance from traditional actors, big shipping companies, Western insurers, dollar-based payments, it gains strength. But when a network of alternative actors exists, pressure is diffused. The system doesn't break, it fragments. Countries and firms act the way rational actors do when faced with constraint. They reduce risk, preserve continuity, and protect value. Governments unwilling to cut ties seek out partners willing to operate in the gray zones. Traders and middlemen develop workarounds because if there is demand for a commodity and a way to supply it, markets will find that way. Over time, these workarounds become normalized. No one celebrates the redundancy, but it becomes the baseline. Once that baseline exists, it doesn't disappear when enforcement intensifies. Those alternative routes, intermediaries, and relationships become part of the operational fabric. They are like detour roads that eventually carry as much traffic as the old highway did, and then more. That's the structural dynamic at play here. Visible pressure focuses on restricting access at the most obvious points, but the underlying system adapts around that pressure. Supply chains find new nodes. Payment flows find new rails. Incentives shift, and what once was marginal becomes functional out of necessity. Over time, these adaptations don't just sustain the old system, they reshape it. In other words, the story of Venezuelan oil over the past year isn't primarily one of blockade and enforcement. It's a story of systemic adaptation, slow, quiet, and easily overlooked by anyone focused on public announcements rather than the mechanics of trade and logistics. That's where the real change is happening, and that's where the long-term consequences will emerge. The most important consequences of what we're watching now won't show up in the next news cycle or even in the next round of policy reviews. They appear later after attention has moved on and decisions have hardened into routines. This is how leverage changes over time. Not abruptly, but gradually as systems adapt and memory sets in. Each time a restriction is bypassed, it becomes easier to bypass the next one. Each workaround becomes part of institutional knowledge. What once required improvisation becomes standard practice. That learning doesn't stay confined to the original case. Other governments observe it. Other firms note what was possible. Other intermediaries recognize where enforcement was thin. Over time, behavior shifts, not in defiance but in expectation. The assumption that rules will be strictly applied gives way to an understanding that they can be managed. Financial power rarely collapses outright. It erodes through repeated avoidance. When transactions move off established rails, they don't disappear. They settle elsewhere. And once those alternative pathways are in place, participants have little incentive to return to the old ones, especially if they believe future pressure is likely. The same dynamic applies to enforcement credibility. When penalties are uneven, delayed, or selectively applied, compliance becomes conditional. Partners begin to calculate not just what is permitted, but what is tolerable. That calculation spreads quietly without formal coordination. What makes these shifts difficult to reverse is inertia. Systems that work even imperfectly tend to persist. Contracts are rewritten, relationships form, infrastructure is built. The cost of dismantling these arrangements grows over time, not shrinks. Rebuilding influence after that point requires more than stronger language or broader authority. It requires restoring confidence that rules are consistent, legitimate, and durable. That's a much slower process than applying pressure in the first place. These consequences rarely attract attention because they don't announce themselves. There's no single moment when leverage is lost. There's just a gradual realization years later that it doesn't operate the way it once did. By the time that realization sets in, the terrain has already changed. This pattern isn't new, and that's what makes it worth paying attention to. We've seen versions of it before. In the case of Iran, the initial rounds of sanctions created genuine strain. Access to finance narrowed, trade volumes dropped, inflation rose. For a time, it appeared that pressure was producing results. But over the years, Iranian institutions adjusted. Alternative payment channels developed. Regional trade deepened. Domestic production substituted for imports where it could. The pressure didn't disappear, but its leverage changed. A similar sequence unfolded with Russia after 2014. Sanctions disrupted banking, investment, and technology access. Yet they also accelerated internal adaptation. Energy exports were rerouted. Financial buffers were built. Non-Western partnerships expanded. Over time, the initial shock gave way to a more resilient, if less efficient system. In both cases, the early phase looked decisive. The middle phase looked contained. The later phase revealed a quieter outcome, reduced influence rather than outright compliance. The recurring logic is consistent. Pressure imposes costs, but it also creates incentives. Actors respond to those incentives not by standing still, but by reorganizing. Supply chains shift. Financing evolves. Relationships adjust. What begins as an exception becomes routine. The common mistake is treating pressure as a single act instead of an ongoing interaction. Pressure works best when time compresses choices. It works less well when time allows learning. Once learning occurs, the balance changes. What's unfolding now follows that same arc. Not perfectly and not identically, but recognizably. The mechanisms are familiar, the responses are rational, and the outcomes, while not immediate, tend to rhyme. The most important point is not that sanctions fail outright. It's that their effectiveness is conditional and temporary unless reinforced by legitimacy, coordination, and patience. When those elements weaken, pressure doesn't vanish. It diffuses. And once that lesson is absorbed, it doesn't remain confined to one case. Other governments observe. Other institutions adapt. Other systems quietly prepare. That's how a tool loses power without ever being formally set aside. Here's the quiet reality. Power today doesn't belong to the actor who announces decisions or signals resolve. It belongs to the system that continues to function after attention shifts elsewhere. The systems that endure are rarely dramatic. They are built quietly, adjusted patiently, and maintained without ceremony. Strength in this sense isn't the ability to apply pressure. It's the ability to apply it without undermining the rules, relationships, and expectations that give that pressure meaning. When pressure moves faster than consensus, it rarely produces surrender. More often, it produces adaptation. This isn't a story about personalities or about who appeared strong in a given moment. It's about whether a strategy changed the underlying structure it was meant to influence. In this case, it didn't remove options. It encouraged new ones. It didn't collapse a system. It helped give rise to parallel systems that operate alongside it. And once parallel systems exist, they don't compete loudly. They simply persist. Over time, influence doesn't disappear. It migrates. It settles where transactions feel predictable, rules feel flexible, and risks feel manageable. That migration is easy to overlook because it happens incrementally. There's no single turning point, just a gradual realization that power no longer behaves the way it once did. Those are the shifts worth noticing. Not because they demand reaction, but because they reshape the landscape quietly long after the headlines have passed.